Is there like latent fear in interacting with her that they say something wrong, like call her Meghan Markle instead of...
Meghan arrived at Kensington expecting a difficult meeting. She was prepared for cold faces, guarded conversations, perhaps even another argument over her place within the royal machine. What she was not prepared for was silence. Her office door opened, and the room beyond it had already been stripped bare. The desk was cleared, personal items were gone. Her workspace had been dismantled before she had even been told the decision had been made. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan stepped inside, then stopped. Kensington Palace, one of the royal residences used for private living and official work, had once given her a place inside the institution. The office represented status and a remaining link to the working royal world. Harry knew the discussion could be tense, yet even he had not imagined that she would arrive to find the decision already carried out. Meghan looked toward the staff member and asked one question: who authorized this? The answer did not come immediately. That hesitation struck harder than any explanation. Her files, stationery, photographs, and personal effects had already been boxed and removed. Nothing suggested a temporary rearrangement. The room no longer looked like a space awaiting her return. It looked like a chapter someone else had decided to close. Harry answered her call moments later, and his anger rose instantly. Meghan told him what had happened, keeping her voice controlled as humiliation sharpened every word. He understood the insult at once. To him, this was not routine administration. Someone had known she was coming. Someone had allowed her to discover the change by opening the door herself. The cruelty was not simply the removal, it was the method. Meghan noticed one detail. The brass nameplate was gone. That meant the decision had moved beyond packing boxes. A staff member confirmed that the office was scheduled to be reassigned, turning a painful discovery into something permanent. Meghan pressed again for the authority behind it. This time, the answer came clearly. William's name entered the conversation. Meghan felt the dispute change instantly. The Prince of Wales, the title held by the heir behind the monarch in the line of succession, now stood at the center of the decision. Yet one question remained. Had William personally ordered the office cleared, or had he merely approved a process moving beneath him? The empty room had become more dangerous than lost furniture. It was now a test of belonging, authority, and family loyalty. And Meghan was no longer willing to leave Kensington without confronting the man whose name stood behind the door. The office had been emptied in hours, but the emotional history surrounding it had been accumulating for years. Meghan saw rejection. Harry saw another attack on his family. William saw unfinished business that could no longer remain suspended between royal duty and private resentment. Catherine understood something quieter. Once boundaries became symbolic, every room, title, invitation, and doorway carried consequences far greater than the object itself. Meghan could not look at that empty space as ordinary administration. The Kensington office had once represented active membership in the royal household, the working structure that supports senior family members in official duties. To her, losing it meant losing one of the last physical links to the period when she had a recognized place inside that system. She was not mourning a desk. She was confronting what the room now seemed to say about her past. William saw the same space through a different lens. Offices inside royal residences reflected current responsibility, access, and function, and he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with arrangements that no longer matched reality. The prince believed leaving the room untouched created ambiguity, yet he also knew that touching it would carry emotional consequences far beyond administration. Harry felt those consequences immediately. He remembered when he and his brother once worked within the same royal structure, when shared corridors and offices symbolized cooperation rather than division. Now Meghan's removal transformed an internal decision into something personal between them. To him, the cleared room looked less like housekeeping and more like a message aimed at his wife. Catherine heard how Meghan had discovered the change and felt uneasy. She understood William's reasoning, but she could not ignore the manner of it. In a private conversation, the princess told him that necessity and humiliation were not the same thing. He did not answer quickly, and she noticed the pause. That silence told her he understood exactly where the damage had been done. Charles had known Kensington was reviewing dormant workspaces, yet the king had chosen not to interfere. His silence mattered because Harry had assumed his father would stop any move that could feel deliberately punitive. The monarch had not ordered the clearance, but he had allowed the process to continue. Meghan then learned something even colder. Her personal belongings had not been thrown away. They had been catalogued, boxed, and separated before removal. That level of precision suggested planning, not impulse. And that raised the question nobody could avoid. Why now? The office had remained untouched long enough to become symbolic. Something recent had forced the palace to act, and the answer lay in a private confrontation that had never been meant to leave Kensington. Weeks before Meghan walked into the empty room, a private meeting inside Kensington Palace had already changed everything. It began as a discussion about boundaries, and ended with a sentence that William could not ignore. No shouting spilled into the corridor. No public statement followed. Yet those present understood that something fundamental had broken. From that afternoon onward, Meghan's office was no longer simply unused space. It had become a test of authority. Meghan had left regular royal duties behind, but the old Kensington office still carried her name in practice. Staff had allowed that arrangement to continue because removing it risked reopening wounds the family had never truly resolved. William increasingly believed royal property had to reflect current responsibility, while Catherine urged caution. The Prince of Wales, the title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest son and heir, was thinking about institutional clarity. She was thinking about emotional consequences. Meghan arrived at the private meeting 3 weeks before the clearance determined to protect that remaining link. She asked William to keep the office available whenever she returned to Britain, arguing that her years inside the royal household gave the space emotional legitimacy. He listened, then answered, with the sentence that changed everything. Palace accommodation could not remain a permanent symbol of a role that no longer existed in practice. Meghan felt the words land as erasure. She told the prince that removing the office would not look neutral. It would look like deliberate rejection. William paused before replying that public interpretation could not decide every internal choice. Catherine watched both of them harden. The princess understood that the argument had stopped being about square footage. Meghan was defending history. William was defending authority. Catherine waited until Meghan had left before speaking again. She told William the room had become dangerous precisely because both sides had loaded it with meaning. He did not disagree. Later that evening, the future king instructed his private secretary to begin reclaiming the space. A private secretary is a senior aide who manages official work and sensitive decisions. The instruction was quiet, formal, and deliberately kept away from public announcement. Staff then discussed whether Meghan should be warned before her next visit. A courtesy message was considered, but it never reached her. That failure would become the darkest detail of the entire episode, because someone knew the risk and still allowed silence to win. Days later, staff learned Meghan would arrive earlier than expected. The office was already empty. The nameplate was already gone. Nobody reversed the process. That is why, when Meghan finally demanded to see William face to face, neither of them believed they were merely discussing an office anymore. The confrontation did not happen before an audience. There were no cameras, advisors, or carefully prepared statements to soften what followed. Meghan asked to see William directly, and when the two finally stood opposite each other, the empty office hung between them like an accusation. She wanted to know why she had been allowed to discover the decision publicly. He wanted to know why every boundary became a personal declaration of war. Meghan refused to leave Kensington until she had an answer from him. A senior aide hesitated, then confirmed that William would meet her alone. The prince entered composed, almost deliberately so, and said the room had been formally reclaimed because it no longer served an active royal office. Reclaiming a royal office simply meant returning palace space to current institutional use. He defended the decision itself, not the way she had discovered it. Meghan kept her voice controlled. That made every word sharper. She told William the office was not the real issue, the humiliation was. Why had nobody respected her enough to call before her belongings were removed? He replied that the palace could not preserve former arrangements forever, simply because changing them might cause anger. She stared at him and answered, "I am your sister-in-law, not an expired lease." William pulled back a chair, silently inviting her to sit. Meghan did not move. Instead, she rested one hand on its back and told the prince that turning family history into procedure was exactly how institutions lost people. He answered that family feeling could not become a permanent veto over necessary decisions. For a moment, neither softened. Then William admitted the part Meghan had come to hear. He had personally approved reclaiming the office. The prince did not retreat from that responsibility, but he insisted he had never instructed anyone to hide the decision from her. Meghan immediately told him something that changed the argument. One staff member had known days earlier that she was coming. William's composure shifted. If her arrival had been known, then a warning had been possible. Someone could have prevented the humiliation and had not done so. Meghan pressed him again, asking whether silence had been carelessness or intent. He refused to guess. William ended the meeting by ordering an internal account of the notification failure. Meghan left without reconciliation, but the conflict had changed shape. She finally knew who approved the removal. He now faced a darker question inside his own household. Who had taken an administrative decision and turned it into a spectacle? The answer would expose not merely a mistake, but the machinery of palace power that had allowed Meghan to walk in unprepared. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. More often, it appears through schedules, access lists, room assignments, signatures, and instructions passed between people who know exactly how much meaning can hide inside ordinary administrative language. As William began tracing how Meghan had been left uninformed, he discovered that the office clearance was not one decision. It was a chain of smaller choices, and one had changed everything. William had approved the change, but approval was only the first step. Palace staff handled packing, storage, security access, scheduling, and notification. These working arrangements were the practical systems deciding who used royal space and how access was managed. The prince had believed the process would remain controlled. Instead, every administrative choice now looked like part of a deliberate humiliation. Charles received a briefing once the dispute erupted. The king chose not to reverse his son's decision, because he believed William needed room to manage responsibilities falling under his authority. Yet the monarch understood why the situation felt cruel. Meghan had not merely lost a workspace. She had discovered the loss by walking into an empty room. William felt exposed. Alone with Catherine, he admitted that a defensible decision had been executed in a way that made humiliation look like the objective. She listened, then asked the simplest question of the crisis: who knew she was coming? The prince stopped defending the office removal and turned instead toward the process that had failed around it. Staff scheduling records provided the first answer. Meghan's expected arrival had been entered several days earlier, and the information was available to the office coordinating the clearance. William then learned something worse. A courtesy message had already been drafted telling her that the room was being reassigned and that her belongings had been moved into secure storage. Secure storage simply meant a controlled area used to protect personal or sensitive property. The message had never been sent. Charles read the internal account twice. The king set it down without speaking, then asked whether anyone could explain why a warning that already existed had been withheld. No clear answer came. His disappointment was no longer centered on the office itself. It was centered on the avoidable cruelty of allowing a family member to discover the decision alone. William finally made his choice. The prince would privately acknowledge that Meghan should have been warned, but he would not restore the office. Catherine understood why that compromise would solve almost nothing. Meghan would hear regret without reversal. Harry would hear apology without accountability. The room would remain lost, the apology would remain limited, and by the next morning the consequences were no longer confined to Kensington's walls. By morning, Meghan no longer looked shocked. That was almost worse. Shock still suggests there is something left to understand. What replaced it was colder, the realization that the office would not be restored, that the decision would stand, and that the apology she received concerned only the way she discovered it. Harry watched that change happen in real time, and what he saw convinced him the family had crossed another invisible line. Meghan received the acknowledgement quietly. The message admitted she should have been warned before arriving, but it made one fact unmistakable: the reassignment was final. In palace language, reassignment simply meant that the room had been returned to another official use. Her belongings could be collected or delivered. Her former office access was removed, and future correspondence would pass through designated channels instead of the old Kensington workspace. Meghan read the message once beside Harry, locked her phone, and spoke quietly. "So they are sorry I saw it. "Not sorry they did it." He did not answer. The distinction was too sharp. Harry understood that the palace was apologizing for the humiliation, without questioning the decision that caused it, and that made the regret feel narrow. Harry called Charles afterward. He demanded to know why his father would allow the office decision to stand after learning how she discovered it. The king answered that he had not ordered the clearance, but he would not overrule William, simply because the execution had been mishandled. Charles knew that reversing the decision now would create a battle over authority, yet he knew his son would hear that logic as abandonment. Catherine tried another approach with William. She asked whether temporarily restoring the room might lower the temperature. The prince refused. He believed that reversing a legitimate boundary under emotional pressure would make every future decision negotiable. Catherine understood the logic, but she could also see the cost. William had protected the principle and deepened the wound. Meghan then changed strategy. She stopped asking for the office back and instructed that every remaining personal item be removed from Kensington. Harry watched her close the final box containing a framed photograph that had once stood on the shelf. She ran her hand across the lid, then stepped away without reopening it. That small act ended one battle. It also created space for another kind of conversation. Catherine reached out privately, not as a palace representative, but as someone who understood what happens when institutional decisions invade family relationships. For the first time since the room was cleared, the next conversation would not be about authority. It would be about whether anything human remained beneath the damage. There were no aides beside them and no briefing notes on the table. Catherine and Meghan met privately because both understood that another official conversation would accomplish nothing. The office had already been emptied. William had already refused to reverse the decision. Harry had already confronted Charles. What remained was more difficult. Two women acknowledging that years of royal tension had turned every practical choice into evidence of love, rejection, loyalty, or betrayal. Catherine had initiated the meeting herself. She asked Meghan to speak away from the offices and made one thing clear before they began. She was not there to negotiate the room's return. The Princess of Wales, the title held by the wife of the heir to the throne, was trying to separate family pain from palace procedure. Meghan agreed reluctantly because she knew Catherine had not ordered the clearance. Meghan arrived guarded and unwilling to accept another carefully managed explanation. Catherine did not offer one. Instead, she said plainly that discovering an empty office without warning had been cruel in effect, even if cruelty had not been the intention. Meghan's resistance softened. For the first time since the humiliation, someone inside the family was separating justification from compassion. Meghan answered with equal clarity. She admitted she had never truly believed the office would remain hers forever. What devastated her was the feeling that her presence had already been erased before anyone found the courage to tell her directly. Catherine listened without interrupting. She reached toward her tea, stopped before lifting the cup, and allowed several seconds of silence to pass. That mattered because the dispute had changed shape. Catherine could not repair the past, and Meghan could not recover what the room once represented. But both had stopped pretending that procedure could explain the wound. Catherine then shared William's private concession. He would not restore the office, but he had ordered changes requiring direct notification whenever future decisions affected family members personally. Meghan understood that the concession was procedural, yet it mattered. The prince was not reversing his boundary, but he was acknowledging that something in the handling had failed. Meghan made her own decision. She told Catherine she would never ask for the office again. The room now represented humiliation, not belonging, and she refused to keep fighting for a symbol that had become poisoned. The two women parted without warmth, but also without another argument. Then the story escaped them. Photographs of Meghan arriving at Kensington and leaving hours later began driving public speculation. The private understanding had come too late to contain the damage. Outside the palace gates, millions were only beginning to decide what the empty office meant. The palace had treated the office as a practical matter. The public did not. Within hours, the story became something larger. A debate about rejection, royal authority, family estrangement, and whether Kensington had simply closed an administrative chapter or staged the clearest symbol yet of Meghan's separation from royal life. One image captured everything. A woman leaving the gates knowing that the room once associated with her name no longer existed. Meghan watched the story spread faster than any private explanation could contain it. Broadcasters began leading with the cleared office, while newspapers framed the decision as either overdue clarity or calculated humiliation. A working royal office, meaning space reserved for people carrying out active duties on behalf of the monarchy, suddenly became the center of a national argument about who still belonged and who no longer did. Harry sat beside her as television panels reduced the conflict to winners and losers. He grew visibly frustrated, especially when commentators treated the family rupture like a contest. Meghan reached for the remote and lowered the sound. She had no interest in hearing strangers debate whether her humiliation had been necessary. He understood that silence, and stopped trying to explain the coverage. William faced the opposite problem at Kensington. The prince read one account describing the incident as a brutal symbolic eviction, then another defending his right to impose boundaries. Catherine watched him absorb the uncomfortable truth. Intent no longer controlled meaning. He might have approved an administrative change, but the public was reacting to the way Meghan discovered it. Mourning made the symbolism impossible to ignore. A major newspaper appeared with a photograph of Meghan leaving Kensington beneath the headline, "The Empty Office." The phrase was simple, but devastating. It turned a room reassignment into a national shorthand for exclusion. Outside the palace gates, a small crowd gathered as broadcasters delivered live reports. Some defended William. Others called the manner needlessly cold. Charles resisted pressure for a dramatic response. The king believed another statement would only deepen the spectacle, and William agreed. Neither man wanted a public war with Meghan, and neither intended to reverse the decision simply because criticism had grown louder. Their restraint said something important. The institution would accept controversy rather than reopen the question of the office. Meghan understood that the argument had moved beyond the room itself. The belongings were gone. The notification failure had been acknowledged. The decision was final. The headlines would eventually fade, but the empty office had already done what years of arguments could not. It forced everyone involved to accept where Meghan now stood, and the final meaning of that acceptance was about to become impossible to avoid. In the end, Meghan did not get her office back. William did not reverse his decision. Harry did not receive the intervention from Charles that he had demanded. Yet the story did not end in another explosion. It ended in clarity. Painful, imperfect, unmistakable clarity. The cleared room became the moment when everyone involved finally stopped pretending that an old royal arrangement could survive after the relationships beneath it had fundamentally changed. Meghan accepted the practical outcome without asking for another reversal. Kensington permanently reassigned the former office. Her belongings were returned, and the nameplate was never restored. That mattered because the room had once represented a recognized place inside the working royal structure. Now it represented something else, proof that preserving a physical symbol could not restore trust, belonging, or relationships that had already changed. Harry remained angry about how his wife had been treated, but his anger shifted. He no longer saw victory as getting the room back. Protecting Meghan from another cycle of symbolic battles mattered more than reclaiming palace space. The Duke of Sussex, the title held by the younger son of the king, understood that recognition from an institution could no longer define the future of his family. William reached his own conclusion after the public storm settled. Catherine asked him privately whether he regretted the decision. The prince answered that he regretted how Meghan discovered it, but not the boundary itself. She understood the distinction immediately. He believed the office had to be reclaimed, yet he also accepted that authority without consideration could turn a necessary decision into a lasting wound. Charles refused to create another family war. The king did not overturn William's authority, and he did not publicly attack Meghan. He accepted that the monarchy could not repair every private fracture through institutional compromise. Sometimes preserving stability meant allowing a painful decision to stand, even when the human cost remained impossible to ignore. Meghan ultimately left Kensington without the office, and William kept the boundary he had drawn. Harry stopped fighting for the room. Catherine had forced compassion into the conversation, while Charles allowed the final arrangement to remain. No ceremony marked that ending, but everyone understood its finality completely. The verdict was clear. The empty office marked the end of ambiguity. Meghan's former place inside that working structure had been formally closed, and nobody pretended otherwise. The manner had been humiliating. The meaning was undeniable. The room belonged to the past, and so did the illusion that nothing between them had permanently changed. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.